Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Yes Means Yes podcast. This is going to be a special episode where intern Ella Hammond takes over and discusses the prevention of sexual assault in the military as part of her social media project through her internship.
I would like to give a trigger warning before we start this episode. We will be discussing content about sexual assault, rape, and murder. If that is not something that you are comfortable with, then I recommend skipping this episode. In April 2020, Vanessa Guillen was murdered, dismembered, and buried in a shallow grave. Her body was discovered in June 2020 and identified a few days later in July. Only one person has been charged in connection with her murder, Cecily Aguilar, the girlfriend of the soldier who murdered Guillen and then killed himself, Aaron Robinson. No motive was revealed for Specialist Guillen's murder, but it has since been revealed that she was sexually harassed prior to her death by another service member unrelated to her murder. Specialist Guillen's death sparked outrage at the military and the climate that allowed this atrocity to occur. My name is Ella, and I'm currently a sophomore at Auburn University majoring in public and one health and minoring in counseling. I'm an intern with Rape Counselors of East Alabama this semester, and today I'm going to be talking about sexual violence in the military. Later on in the episode, I have a special guest, Kayla Williams from the RAND Corporation, which she will talk all about, to explain her work with sexual violence prevention in the military. Until then, I want to give you guys some more background information and statistics regarding sexual assault in the military. When Vanessa Guillen was murdered in April 2020, there were whispers of unrest at the recently renamed Fort Cavazos, formerly known as Fort Hood. Fort Cavazos had been the center of controversy for years, with numerous deaths, suicides, and sexual harassment complaints. Guillen's murder prompted the investigation of the base, after which 14 Army officials were either fired or suspended. The chain of command and climate at Fort Cavazos was found to have major flaws that allowed sexual assault and harassment to be swept under the rug. But Fort Cavazos was not the only military base struggling with high numbers of sexual assaults and mental distress. The military in this country has for years perpetuated a high standard that they must be held to. But this standard doesn't seem to include accurate reporting and handling of sexual assault cases. According to an opinion piece from CNN by Ashley Merriman, the military has regulations stating that informal harassment complaints should be resolved at the, quote, lowest appropriate level, end quote, or basically working it out on your own without involving your supervisors. This inhibits the effective reporting and prevention of sexual assault. Merriman also states, quote, according to a 2020 analysis by the DoD of active duty service members surveyed, women who were sexually harassed in 2018 were 12 times more likely to be sexually assaulted that year. Men who were sexually harassed were 42 times more likely to be sexually assaulted that year, end quote. This demonstrates that the service members who are being sexually harassed are at a much, much higher risk of being victims of sexual assault. Or in other words, they're being targeted because they're seen as easy targets, or the culture of the military allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked, sexual harassment to go unchecked, which makes perpetrators believe that they can get away with sexual assault. So based on some data from 2012, which I know was 11 years ago now, so it's quite outdated. Only 3,300 service members officially reported their assaults, but there were 26,000 anonymously reported assaults in the same year, in the year 2012. So this is according to the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, who also claim that the military should be an environment conducive to reducing assault, not only within the military, but across the nation. Even though that data is quite outdated, I think the idea of it remains true, that there are far fewer officially reported cases of sexual violence and way more anonymously reported cases because of the culture of the military And it makes it hard for survivors to come forward officially when they feel like their lives, their experiences are being swept under the rug. So there is this standard that the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence is talking about, that service members are strictly held to, which does not include the normalization of sexual violence. When sexual assault runs rampant in the military, civilians lose trust in this standard that the military is supposed to be upholding. If service members are not held responsible for sexual violence, how can the rest of the nation really expect to hold civilians accountable? The military is supposed to create this safe interpersonal environment that's conducive to solving national and international issues effectively, but this environment clearly is not able to prevent sexual assault from occurring. So how can we expect it to solve issues of national importance? So what are people recommending? Some say a complete overhaul of the military is necessary. New management, new regulations, new systems. This is not necessarily plausible in the world that we currently live in, and sexual violence is not the top priority for the military at the moment. Now, most people say that this lowest level rule should be thrown out, that all reports of harassment should be taken seriously, which I agree with wholeheartedly, and I think it would be a really easy change to implement. And when people believe that their issues are being taken seriously, it makes them more likely to open up, tell their stories, and report at a higher level. Now, there are some people who say that we can use the structure that the military already has to improve the lives and health of service members. There's this chain of command structure for a reason. And if it's used properly, and high-ranking members of the military are trained properly, and they genuinely believe that sexual violence can be prevented and they can prevent sexual violence, then the reporting process can be handled properly and efficiently, and people who need to be protected can be protected. If members of this chain of command don't follow the proper procedures, if they commit acts of sexual violence, then they have to be held responsible. There is a need for greater accountability for the actions or non-actions of the military. A really common phrase that's been used a lot lately in terms of racial attacks is silence is violence, and I think that applies here too. Not saying anything, preventing reporting is an act of violence in and of itself, and it only serves to hurt people. So speaking up is like the most important thing that I think that the military can do, and training people properly to report any acts of violence that they see, I think is really important, and just making sure that this chain of command structure, everybody knows their role and is using it properly. So obviously that past data was from 2012, but as of November of 2021, the Air Force was the only branch with full-time employees overseeing sexual assault prevention programs. All the other branches have part-time employees or employees who have other tasks as well. So their focus is not necessarily 100% on these sexual assault prevention programs. Now, the United States Department of Defense Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office works with all the branches of the military to attempt to establish systems that have a positive impact on the levels of sexual assault in the military. The office takes a public health approach, which I love, to sexual assault prevention, it treats it as a population issue, not an individual one, which is the entire basis of public health, and that this issue impacts the communities it occurs in and the nation as a whole. So this public health approach, instead of taking an individual case, fixing that issue at an individual level, moving on, this approach instead takes each case and compiles them together to say, how are all of these instances, these occurrences affecting the nation, the military? How is it affecting social behaviors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Which, like I said, whole point of public health is to take these problems and make individual problems a national or population problem. But how can service members protect our country when they're too worried about being attacked by the person standing next to them? You know, the people who are in a unit are meant to be your brothers, your sisters, your siblings. Those people who are standing next to you, you're supposed to have trust with them, and a trust beyond, this is a person in my unit. It's like an inherent trust. So how can we possibly expect that service members are going to be able to have that level of trust when they are so concerned about, is the person next to me going to be the one who attacks me? It's just something to consider. Another layer to the impacts of sexual assault. So, with that being said, I want to go ahead and introduce Kayla Williams from the RAND Corporation.
Hi, I'm Kayla Williams, and I'm a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institution. I served on the study team at RAND that did the 2014 Workplace and Gender Relations Survey for the Department of Defense that updated the terminology used by DoD to ask about sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military. I also served on the DoD Independent Review Commission on sexual assault and harassment in the military as the representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs to DoD at that point in time. And now I'm really happy to be back at RAND and be able to continue working on some of these issues. And in particular, one of the projects that I'm on now is assessing DoD's rollout of a prevention workforce that is tasked specifically with trying to stop harmful behaviors to the self and to others from happening in the first place, as opposed to responding to these harmful behaviors after they have occurred, which was one of the recommendations made by the Independent Review Commission, since there really is a different skill set involved in preventing harmful behaviors versus supporting victims and survivors after they've already been harmed.
So we had some interns send in questions, and then I had some questions, so I will go ahead and ask those. So our first question is from one of our interns, and she was wondering, what do you believe drives abuse in the military setting?
That is like the $64 million question, right? I think we all want to know what is the core underlying factor. If there was one thing that we could identify and then fix that one thing, it would be so convenient, right? But unfortunately, it does seem like it's probably not just one factor and is probably a little more complicated than that. So I'm going to try to go at this from a slightly different angle and talk about some of the factors that we know make people more at risk of experiencing sexual assault in a military setting. So we know, for example, that women are at increased risk. Junior enlisted folks are at increased risk, and sexual and gender minorities are at increased risk. We also know that different folks have different types of experiences. So, for example, what I mean is that men are more likely to report that the abuse they experienced was in a context of bullying or hazing, while women are more likely to report that their sexual assaults occurred when alcohol was present, either on the part of the accused or the victim. We see that in some cases, maybe the power differential is really important and is one factor that may come into play. And then in some other settings, it may be that folks who are more likely to be in situations where someone doesn't know as much as we would want them to about what healthy relationships and consent look like, or how to respond appropriately. So this tells us, among other things, that these factors can be pretty complicated, and that we're not going to have one simple solution that will address all of the contexts in which abuse occurs in a military setting. And in some settings, we may need to focus more on changing a culture that thinks that hazing is an acceptable way to try to build unit cohesion. And in others, we may need to be really more focused on teaching folks to understand consent more, and healthy relationships, and bystander intervention to protect those who may be trying to figure out how to engage appropriately with one another for the first time. And then, of course, we do have situations where there are just sexual predators who are willing to take advantage of any opportunity to try to abuse folks, and are looking for environments or units where they believe this type of behavior will be tolerated, and will go after those that they think could be vulnerable to this type of behavior. But again, I think the key takeaway here is that there isn't one simple driving factor behind abuse that we can fix that one factor and it's going to eliminate the problem overall. There are a multitude of factors that may need to be addressed concurrently, but in different ways, if we really want to dramatically drive down rates.
What changes, this is another question from one of our interns, which we kind of answered a little bit, but is there any other changes that you think would be conducive to improving the numbers that we're getting of reporting and making the military a safer environment?
I think there are a couple things that we need to focus on at the same time. One is to really increase accountability and increase the way that survivors and victims who choose to report are treated, so that they're more comfortable coming forward and can ensure that folks are in fact held accountable for this behavior after the fact. That could also have somewhat of a deterrent effect against those predators who, think that they may be able to get away with it. Mm-hmm. We also need to be really focused on other things that have been shown to prevent harmful behaviors in general. So, for example, alcohol is a common underlying risk factor for a number of harmful behaviors to the self and others, not just sexual assault, but also self-harm and some other harmful behaviors. So trying to address potentially the accessibility of alcohol, or a culture that encourages alcohol misuse, could be part of a broader effort to prevent these harmful behaviors. I really do think as well that for folks in leadership positions to believe that this is a problem that they can make a difference on is critically important. I have in the past heard from some military leaders that they think that this is a behavior that they can't control among people assigned to their units. And I really object to that because, you bring folks into the military and through training, you convince them to be willing to take the life of another human being during combat, which is something we're all raised from childhood to think that one does not kill. So if we can overcome that and also convince folks that even as marijuana is legalized in an increasing number of states around the country, it is still not allowed for military personnel, then surely we can also clearly and convincingly convey that sexual assault is also not tolerated in the military, even if people think that it might be, tolerated in the civilian sector. The military really is a different type of environment. It is a more closed environment. There are regulations on what color nail polish you can have, how long men's sideburns can be. So I think that the overall culture and the command climate can set the tone and make a big difference in the rates that you see in individual units.
Okay. So I'm sure you're familiar with Vanessa Guillen's murder in 2020, and the investigations and everything that followed that. How do you think that those investigations went, and also like how they might have created more interest in prevention of sexual assault? Because we know that she had expressed that she was being sexually harassed by another member of the military that was not related to her murder.
The problem of sexual assault in the military is definitely not new, and there have been periodic spikes in public interest to the problem through history. I'd say, the tailhook scandal was a big one, and then when the documentary The Invisible War came out, there was another spike in interest and led to some somewhat sustained interest on Capitol Hill from some members of Congress. But as you note, the Vanessa Guillen murder really did spark a level of public interest that I had never seen before, and a really sustained willingness on the part of many military women and women veterans to share their own stories and be very outspoken and engaged. And a big difference that I saw as well was in the number of military men who seemed to be paying attention and appalled in a way that it was just quite new.
Yeah.
At that point, then the investigation that we saw at Fort Hood itself really was quite damning, and I think contained a lot of very helpful information for military leaders, and I think also set the stage for the independent review commission that Secretary Austin called for, which ultimately resulted in quite a few recommendations, and in a really unprecedented way, Secretary Austin did agree to implement all of those recommendations, including supporting changes to the Uniform Code of Military Justice that had previously been really objected to by the Department of Defense for quite some time. So I do really believe that the attention that the atrocious murder of Vanessa Guillen drew to this issue has driven significant change that will hopefully benefit many, many more military personnel in the coming years.
So one last question. How do you think that people who aren't service members can get involved with seeking justice for victims of sexual assault in the military?
I'm going to take this in two really different directions.
Okay.
So, first, I really want to encourage everyone to be a part of broader societal change. This starts, in my opinion, at the youngest ages. It may sound really silly or weird, maybe not as much to your generation, but certainly to my generation or older. Starting when my kids were very, very small, I worked on teaching both my son and my daughter the importance of consent and that they deserved the right to control their own bodies. That no means no. If that's your mom tickling you or your grandpa wanting a hug or whatever it may be, that you deserve to control your own body and that you must respect somebody else when they set a boundary. And I think it's important for all of us to work on consistently giving that message to everyone, because today's service members and tomorrow's service members started out as civilians and started out as little kids, just like all the rest of us. And so we have to think big picture and long term on some of those changes. We have to, as a society, decide to reject rape myths and decide that we believe women and that we will hold people accountable for assault. And I said women because the stats show that women are more likely to be victims. And please do not take that to mean that I'm suggesting that men are not also victims and that transgender and non-binary folks are not also victims. They certainly are, and the latter two at significantly higher rates. But stats alone, women do make up the majority of survivors of sexual assault. Within the military context, how folks outside the military can be involved, I think that staying abreast of the news is important, and making your opinions about these issues heard by your elected officials. So if there's something that's come up as a bill in Congress, your elected representatives pay attention if you contact them and share your thoughts. And so you should be involved and engaged, and you should vote and vote into office people who take these issues seriously, both in terms of military survivors of sexual trauma and outside of the military. It is incredibly important that we vote into office people who believe in accountability and do not endorse rape myths and so forth. I think if you really want to be involved in other levels, you can also seek out nonprofit organizations that work with survivors of sexual trauma in the military. You can donate money, you can look into volunteering, you can look into other ways to show support. And I think another way that to me can be really important is to listen to survivors' individual voices. There are some incredible books like Formation by Ryan Lee Dosty that gives a really intimate first-person account of her own experience with sexual trauma, and giving the honor of truly hearing people's own stories, reading their stories and hearing their voices is a good way to show respect for these diverse instances and their core humanity, and also understanding in a new way what these experiences can be like and how you may be able to make a difference in a way that feels meaningful to you.
Kayla, thank you so much. Thank you for giving those resources. And so I lied when I said that was our last question. We have one more question. What is your message to survivors?
My message to survivors is that therapy is really great. I don't mean to laugh and sound awkward, but it's really important to realize that there are evidence-based forms of therapy that can help you live the kind of life that you want to live. And if you are a survivor of military sexual trauma in particular, VA has a lot of great resources, including vet centers, where even folks who are not otherwise eligible may be able to get care. The crisis line, which is 988, and veterans can press 1, is always there if you need to talk to somebody immediately. There are also apps. There's an MST app where there are lots of resources and self-care tips and tools, meditation practices, things like that. And to understand the array of different types of modalities and what may work for you. Prolonged exposure therapy is one of those that's considered a gold standard, but it can be really difficult for some people. So if you're not ready to do that, you can look into other types of treatment and be open and willing to talk to your therapist about what treatments you want to try, and be willing to fire your therapist, right? Like, very few of us marry the first person we ever go out on a date with. Right? But we think like, oh, this is the therapist that I got, so like I have to stick with this therapist. But if you don't click with them, you can ask for a new therapist. It's an intimate relationship, and you can say, oh, I want one of this gender, I want one of this who focuses on this particular type of modality. I try to say to folks, if you bought a tube of toothpaste and you hated the flavor, you wouldn't quit brushing your teeth. You would just buy a new flavor of toothpaste. So if you go to a therapist that is not the right fit for you, find a different therapist. Don't walk out on therapy.
Right.
But, you know, for me, going to therapy has been a really important part of being able to have the kind of relationships that I want to have, to be able to live the type of life that I want to live, and be present as a parent for my kids in a way that I want to be there for them. So I really just encourage folks to, you know, do what you need to do to get yourself to a place that you want to be, because there's so much out there that makes this world a beautiful and wonderful and fulfilling place to explore and to be, and you deserve to explore that world feeling safe and comfortable.
I second that. I agree. I just want to say a huge, huge thank you to Kayla for being a part of this podcast. If you wish to get in contact with her, all her information is on the RAND website. She was awesome, and it was just really wonderful to have her expertise here to talk about sexual violence prevention in the military. So to wrap things up, I want to give a few more statistics about sexual violence in the military. A RAND survey from 2018 of military members found that 20,000 people had been sexually assaulted in the past year. 6.2% of all military women and 0.7% of all military men. RAND research indicates that approximately half of sexual assaults in the military target LGBTQ+ members. And another RAND study demonstrates that 8,000 service members left the military within a 28-month period after they were sexually harassed, and 2,000 more left after they were sexually assaulted. These numbers are obviously staggering. So please make sure that if you know someone who's in the military, that they are safe, and just make sure they're well, and make sure that they don't just think they're safe. Like, make sure that they know they're safe and they're in a good place. And I just think it's important to be reminded that sexual assault can happen to any person at any time, and we should always believe survivors. As far as sources go, I used 5 articles for today's episode. From the New York Times, What to Know About the Death of Vanessa Guillen. From the RAND Corporation, Preventing Sexual Violence in the Military. From CNN, Sexual Assault Prevention in the Military Needs These 2 Fixes. from the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, Where We Stand, Military Sexual Assault, and finally, some information from the U.S. Department of Defense Sexual Assault Prevention and Response website. Of course, I want to do a big reminder that RCEA offers a 24-hour crisis hotline, that we have medical and legal advocacy, and we do prevention education. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to direct them to our website.